Hey, entrepreneurs, let's talk about shifting yourself into a different state that helps you to get things done or to rise to the challenge to be able to accomplish something difficult. So there's different ways you can shift your own state. State management it's not just one idea, it's a whole compilation of different tributaries that flow into determining what state you're in at any given moment. Some of those are physiological, some of those are psychological, some of those have to do with things that have been priming you recently. For example, there's a number of research studies that look at different kinds of psychological phenomenon in which the experimenters will use something called priming, which those of you who've read some Cialdini's work are familiar with already. But just this concept that I could prime your brain to think of certain things by feeding you stories or certain kinds of words that you may not even consciously recognize the association that they all have something to do with, say, aging, in which case in some research studies, interestingly, people walk slower out of the experiment than if they've been exposed to words that have to do with youth and vigor and strength. And so there's this priming effect that is real, but it's short term. So there's some things like caffeine that on a physical level I could use to change my state. So if, for example, I take 200 milligrams of caffeine, I'm going to naturally have all of those physiological changes in my state that cause me to be more goal focused and driven. But there's a feedback loop for something like caffeine where the adenosine receptors in my brain are actually going to upregulate because they're going to say there's not enough adenosine, so they start proliferating, growing new adenosine receptors to receive the buildup of adenosine, which is a metabolite, a byproduct of being awake. It's one of the things that builds up and creates sleep pressure, that when you sleep, it drops off. You wake up in the morning and sleep pressure builds again gradually the longer you're awake. And so it's a foundational, extremely important aspect of your survival. So your body has this built-in mechanism to ensure that you don't ignore that by just continuously drinking caffeine instead of sleeping. And so as a result, caffeine stops working after about 21 days or so on the same dose. You develop tolerance to where all you're really doing when you say, well, it still works, I can feel the difference, you're just returning yourself to what would have been your baseline if you had not developed tolerance to caffeine. So there's things like that we can use for state management that are short-term. Then there's short-term things like priming that actually have the reverse effect. Long-term, the more I use priming to shift myself into a different state, the more I get used to being in that different state, the more that different state becomes the natural state for me, almost like a cumulative sort of a compounding effect where I actually become more and more the real person. My default state becomes being that person who's in a different state. As an example, I once worked with somebody who was slightly depressed, but they're really working with me on some marriage issues. This was back when I was doing clinical work as a clinical psychologist. And one of the things that held them down, psychologically speaking anyway, was that they didn't believe themselves to be a nice person. So we started talking about how you could become a nice person. And they're, in the depressed state, the defeatist mentality comes out, and the response was, well, but that's faking. Now I'm just not even being myself. You're asking me to be somebody that I'm not. And so we talked through that idea that, well, at first you'd be faking it, but after a while, that would become your normal default mode of interacting with people, at which point you'd no longer be faking it, and you'd be in such a habit of treating people this nice way that now that is the real you. And so it's like that with state management and priming. Let's say that I want to be the kind of person who can endure hardship and show up at work and put in long hours. Well, I can use caffeine short term to help with that, but it's going to wear off. So if I want to change my state using priming, this is something I can practice and get better at over time. And I can actually cause myself to become a person who instinctually thinks a certain way because I've practiced thinking that way long enough that I've laid the neurological ruts that makes it easier for my brain to travel down that channel, that pathway. But it doesn't always start that way, right? So let's say I'm at the end of 4 coaching calls in a row and my blood sugar's low and I'm feeling the dopamine just dragging because for whatever reason, this particular problem I'm working on with the client isn't stimulating my curiosity as much as it might in other circumstances. And I feel like quitting, I feel like giving up, I feel like calling the session early, telling them I'm just too tired, sorry, let's come back to this. And then I think, you know what? I can use some priming to shift my state right now. And I think about a surgeon who's been in surgery for 8 hours straight in the operating room. And I imagine the person's life who's on the line if they don't do it right, if they can't finish the job well. And suddenly, by imagining myself in that scenario, or even just imagining another person in that scenario, I'm actually using priming to wake up a meta program in my brain that says adrenaline. It releases the adrenaline, right? Psychologically, what it says is this matters. What it says is hardship is nothing. I can overcome that. I will overcome that. I must overcome that. The stakes are too high, right? So I'm activating this meta program. I'm not saying any of that stuff to myself. I'm not using affirmations, and I'm not using positive thinking. I'm not coaching myself by saying, Todd, you can do it. Just focus on the problem. Instead, I'm just using priming. I'm just tapping into my own subconscious that has a whole repository of stories like that from real life or from movies, fictional stuff, and I'm using it, right? Or I might pull a memory from the book, The Red Circle, where someone in the military talks about some of the difficult training they went through. And I imagine, like, after the third day of just walking and having nothing to eat, what it was like for him. And suddenly my capacity to endure hardship goes up because I'm doing a little bit of mental contrasting there. When I was in college, I played soccer. And for 1 year, maybe it was 2 years, my dad was an assistant coach on the team and talented soccer player himself. I listened to his advice. He knew me. He watched me a little closer, obviously, me being his son. And so when he came down right before our head coach put me into the game, he said, don't hold back, because he had noticed that I had this tendency to reserve my energy, not to sprint quite as fast as I was capable of, because I'm always reserving for that, some instinct in me that just makes me do that naturally. If I imagine that scenario where I'm standing on the sidelines, I'm warming up my legs, I'm ready to go in, I've instantly primed myself to shift back into a state of high energy exertion. So these are just ideas. I'm just showing you examples. It's going to be unique to you, whatever that story is for you, where you remember you suddenly needed the energy and it was something deeply meaningful. You can use that to shift yourself into a different state. And again, what we're doing here is we're practicing on a micro level, something that priming just only works for very short periods of time. We're talking in the order of minutes. If you start getting primed by your environment and you're focusing attention back to something else and you're not re-priming yourself. But what happens over time is you get more and more capable of stepping into that state of being, and it becomes more of your normal. And it can go the other way too, right? So this is not just for ramping yourself up to expend energy. If I'm stressed, I have too much energy flowing through me, and I'm too worried or concerned about how I'm not getting enough done, or that person thinks this bad thought about me, or whatever it is that's stressing me out. This is there's the potato strategy, which is probably about as ridiculous as it sounds, where you just say, I'm just like, would you go out of your way to save a potato that fell out of the back of a pickup truck and was about to get run over by traffic? Nah, it's just a potato. Who cares? We can get a bunch more of those. And this is a strategy that some people would use to say, I'm not that important. I'm just like a potato. And when you shift to thinking that way, when you think, I'm just a potato, what you're doing is you are temporarily downregulating the importance in your mind of protecting yourself. You're decreasing the need to say, I'm so important. I need to elevate myself. My story is what matters here on planet Earth. And it shifts it to, really, I'm just kind of one person among many trying to accomplish things. I'm not that important. And oddly enough, that can decrease your stress, and it can cause you to perform better when you step on the stage and it really does matter. But you're thinking, I'm just a potato. And so your stress levels go down, but then your performance actually goes up. So depending on the circumstance, you might want to prime yourself in different directions. So my challenge to you this week is just to identify one gap. A gap, what I mean by that is between what you're capable of and what you often show up and find yourself being. In other words, you have different self states. And sometimes you are at your peak, you're at the top of your game, and sometimes you're not. And so I would just ask you to identify one gap where there's this differential between how you often show up and what you're capable of showing up as. And then see if you can identify 2 or 3 thoughts, 2 or 3 memories. Could be fictional, could be real stuff, things that are just natural primers, things that activate a meta program by just tapping into the subconscious meta program for being a different version of you that's more capable of showing up in a way that you want to show up. And just practice with that this week. Once you've identified those 3 things, anytime you notice yourself slipping towards a state that's not as conducive to accomplishing what you need to accomplish, try pulling up those 1 or 2 of those priming thoughts, practice with it. You'll get better at this skill if you use it more, and let's see what you can do. Talk to you again next week.